Good afternoon. Welcome again to the Indian Local Author Celebration here at the Norwalk Public Library. Our afternoon event, 2 p.m. this afternoon, the title is Fiction, Where Do I Fit In? And we have 5 wonderful writers here, and I'd like them to share their information.
Thank you, Cindy, and thanks to the library for having us today, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I'm Libby Waterford, and I write steamy contemporary romance. So the reason why I say steamy contemporary romance is because that is the subgenre of romance that I write. You can see this is my latest release. It's called Take a Bow. It's the second book in my Sawyer's Cove series. And when we're talking about fiction, where do I fit in? Figuring out what genre you write in is kind of the first step, and it's not always easy. I'm sure you all have something you could say about that. But I always knew I wanted to write in romance, but then romance is such a vast genre that where, you know, I thought I love to read historical romance. Maybe I should write historical romance, and then I attempted to write a historical romance. I got about half a chapter in and realized that this was not the genre for me because I do not want to do research. So I then decided that contemporary was probably a better time period for me and my writing. But even within contemporary, there are so many subgenres. There's paranormal, there's billionaire romance. You could just drill down and down and down. And so I think that when you're thinking about books that you like to read and books that you like to write, to be as specific about the genre that you are interested in, the better that you will have a chance of finding readers who want to read that specific genre. And that's another wonderful thing about fiction is there's something for everybody. So whether you write something super specific like how paranormal cowboys in a steampunk time period, or if, like me, you write about Hollywood actors going to small seaside Connecticut towns and falling in love with a local librarian. You know, there's something for everybody. So, yeah, that's the plot of this book. Nash is he's a TV actor / singer-songwriter, and he never performs live, and so when he comes to Misty Harbor, which is the setting for my small town series, he does fall in love with Mimi, the local head librarian of the Misty Harbor Library, and she convinces him that he's going to perform at her annual library fundraiser, and the rest is history. So it's just such a delight to be here with you all today, and I think I'll pass the mic over to Richard.
Okay. I'm probably sharp contrast, Libby. I enjoy her novels, by the way, but I don't think at all about genre, never have. I write what I want when I want to write it. First books I published, they were self-published 50 years ago. They were children's stories, but children's stories meant for everybody. I hadn't a clue what I was doing. 50 years ago, very few people were self-publishing. I got lucky. I picked a good title, The Lizard of Oz. I ended up having 3 printings, okay?
Wow.
And I got good reviews from like Library Journal, Book List, Philadelphia Bulletin, all just by sending things out. But that was back in the days when nobody was doing self-publishing. Now there are probably 1 million people publishing every year, and it's a lot harder to get an audience. Also, I helped that I did it by hand lettering it instead of typesetting it, which made it look very childlike and whatever. And the whole tone was childlike, though the audience was really adult. So we forget about the genre. The next thing I published was a historical novel. About a Russian officer of the guard who became an explorer in Ethiopia and fought in Manchuria and became a monk and got involved in a heresy and fought in World War I and was murdered on his doorstep in 1919. Anyway, it was a fun story. It's about a real guy. I stumbled upon him. I ended up meeting his sister, who was 97 years old at the time and living in Canada. Interviewed her for 30 hours. And anyway, I had lots of stuff. So that was a different kind of thing. I got lucky. I was working for Digital Equipment, the computer company, and doing the company newspaper, so I interviewed an employee who had had a novel published. Sounded interesting. I contacted his agent, who was a former DEC salesman. He was the sort of guy who could sell anything, whether this was a computer or a book. I said, he liked my book, he sold it. And it was published by a piece of Houghton Mifflin. I got a contract for 3 novels. The subsidiary got in a fight with the home company. Only one book was ever published, and that was the end of that. Anyway, so that was part of my journey. When working at DEC, they had me write a book about Alta Vista, the search engine that came before Google. It was the first book for a commercial book for ordinary people about how search engines work. And for an entire year, they just paid me my salary. I sat home and I wrote a book. Then they sent me around the world to make speeches about the internet. Anyway, so that was a different kind of an experience. And when DEC went under, the agent that I had gotten to handle the Alta Vista book sold 3 books for me. In that case, it's different with nonfiction. She'd come to me and tell me what the publishers were looking for, and I'd give her an outline and a chapter, and she'd come back with a contract. Anyway, those were the old days, the early days of the internet. Meanwhile, I did a translation of books that this Russian guy had written about his experiences in Ethiopia. It was unique material. There's nothing else like it. Academic publishers wouldn't touch it, though, even with recommendations from the departments of history, because they didn't think they'd sell enough copies. So I posted it on the internet, on my website, and I got an email from a grad student in Germany who happened to be the great-grandson of the emperor who was in the book. And with his letter, he's saying it needs to be published. I was able to find a publisher for it. So that's a different kind of a book. Since then, I've been, I now live in Milford in a 1-bedroom apartment with 4,000 books, and I do nothing but just write fiction. Whatever I want to write, whenever I want to write it, without worrying about what kind of genre it is. I'd rather write the next book than market the last one. I have a lot of fun with it. I've had 7 of my books have been published by All Things That Matter Press, and over the last 4 years. And there's another one due out next month. And I've got 2 other books that I'm going to try sort of a hybrid way. I heard about Book Locker at an event last month, so they're about to come out with a book of jokes of mine, a book of 3,000 jokes that I've been playing with on Twitter. 500 pages of jokes. Okay, that'll be fun. It's a different kind of genre. And I'm also probably going to do a collection of essays with them. I just sent them a draft yesterday. Then I've got 2 other novels that I've written that I don't know what the hell to do with. I mean, all this time, I would love to find an audience. So I'm still out there trying to get an agent again, okay? And the other agents from the past have all retired. And so I've been sending these around with the queries, and it is such totally frustrating. I'll probably put up with it for another few months. And if it doesn't, I'll probably go with Book Locker again. I'd rather pay $1,000 and have them do it and get it out in a month than go to All Things and wait a year for it to appear. At my age, I don't have all that much time, and I'd rather get the books out there. So anyway, that's sort of my journey.
I'm exhausted. That's my name. So, I'd like to read a bedtime story. My name is Charles Belson, and the book that I'm reading from is Wise Men Live in Houses Built by Fools, an architect's memoir by Charles Belson. This is chapter 1. Remember, it's a bedtime story. Relax. Very calming. I have a perfect voice to put you to sleep. Inside a gray metal lockbox containing important papers saved by my parents, I find an old black and white photograph of my mother and father. They pose with my two sisters on the great lawn at the edge of the Butterfly Meadow at the eastern Long Island estate known as Notamiset. The meadow between the main house and the hunting lodge overlooks the Aspatuck Creek. Those who see the photo usually say it looks like a professionally composed family portrait, except for the boy in the bushes. Then they ask, "Is that you?" My response depends on who asks the question. I tell most people that the boy in the bushes is not me, because I wasn't born yet, which is true. But that is not what I tell people who would believe that the boy in the bushes may be my doppelganger, or my alter ego, or the bad boy in me, itching to mess up somebody else's carefully composed photo in a way that makes the original photograph look even more interesting. After the photo shoot, my parents and my two sisters walked to the main house where my grandparents lived during the summer. This 30-acre estate in Quaog, a hamlet west of Quogue, is separated from West Hampton Beach by Tick Island and the Aspatuck Creek. In Quaog, before there was an Notamiset estate, there's a very large farm owned by two Irish immigrants. According to the Quaog Historical Profile, located in the local Historical Society library, John Egger and his sister Margaret came to this country from Ireland in the mid-1800s. They purchased a huge tract of land which comprised most of what we know today as Quaog. Based on vintage maps and historic U.S. Census data, I learned that my great-grandfather, John Egger, and his older sister Margaret do acquire significant acreage, but they do not purchase it. At age 23, Margaret marries farmer Francis Foley, an Irish immigrant with one of the largest farms in Quaog. Margaret's brother John is only 13 at the time. When John marries 9 years later, his sister and brother-in-law generously give him and his new wife a small house on a 6-acre parcel after subdividing it from the larger Foley farm. After Francis Foley dies, Margaret Egger Foley sells her waterfront farmland. Part of it becomes the Butterfly Meadow at Notamiset. Margaret's brother John names his only child Alexander Winfield Egger and nicknames him Win. As a trick rider and a crack shot, Win calls himself Buffalo Bill of the East. He meets Mary Trumbull, his future wife, at Lomas Dance Hall. They win the cakewalk contest. Buffalo Bill becomes the local constable. He patrols the village on horseback. Win inherits his father's farm. He adds a bigger barn and a riding stable and ring for lessons he gives summer people. As Buffalo Bill, he is decked out with pistols, chaps, and cowboy hats. As Win Egger, he competes for the loneliness of growing up compensates for the loneliness of growing up as an only child by having his own family of 9 children. He loves the circus that his life becomes, so long as he remains the ringmaster. On Sunday mornings, Win's wife Mary walks their brood across the street to the Church of the Immaculate Conception. Win's Aunt Margaret donated the land for this church, which shares a rear property line with Notamiset. From the rocking chair on his front porch, Win calls those inside the church damned fools for sitting around praying for something when they could be out working for it instead. On his day of rest, Win prefers malt whiskey to communion wine. Early on, when Win is financially flush, he becomes a founding member of the Quaog Fire Department and donates some of his own farmland as the site for a new firehouse. In tougher times, he sells acreage to make his ends meet. Once, when his horses need new shoes, he asks his second youngest daughter, my mother Catherine, for help. She is saving for her high school trip to Washington, but she gives him her savings without complaint. Catherine works nearby as a weekday live-in au pair girl. Her employer, Mrs. Rayner, overhears my grandfather on his visit to ask his daughter for money. At first, Mrs. Rayner refrains from interfering in any way, but later she generously covers the cost of my mother's entire senior trip to Washington, D.C. At the age of 78, Buffalo Bill suffers a fatal stroke while standing on a hay cart pitching hay to his horses. I'm 7 at the time, and I watch wide-eyed from his front porch as marching bagpipers, mounted horsemen, firefighters in antique fire engines, policemen in cars with flashing lights, the mayor, and the Egger clan all arrive to celebrate his life. They gather inside the church whose doors he rarely darkened. Within a few months, his wife Mary sells his farm to the Roman Catholic Church. They waste no time turning Wynn's heaven on earth into a jumbo-sized parking lot. Ben Allen lives directly behind the Catholic Church. He is 4 years older than Buffalo Bill. Ben is the New York banker who named his new estate Notamiset in 1920 after meeting Chief Notamiset in Navajo country in New Mexico. He and his wife Louise hire a young couple, originally from Augustov, Poland, as their groundskeeper and housekeeper. Casimir and Helena Bukowski pick Charlie and Helen Belson as their American names. English rugby star F. Charles Belson is one of the young Casimir's heroes. Charlie and Helen live in a small but sturdy cedar-shingled house on higher ground not far from the church. Their house was one of the lucky few to survive the legendary hurricane of 1938 unscathed. Every summer, they move back into the staff quarters located behind the kitchen in the Allens' main house at Notamiset. Charlie and Helen are highly valued as year-round environmental stewards of the land and conservators of the house. During summers, the 4 Allen children always look forward to visiting what they call Charlie and Helen's place. The children affectionately name their loyal and protective river swans Charlie and Helen. One of the Allen children has a son who marries a Native American Navajo. The son's wife confirms that Chief Notamiset made up his name. He never was a chief. The name Notamiset means nothing in the native Navajo language. None of this matters to Ben Allen. He remains fond of Notamiset as a name, a place, and a way of life. After Ben dies, Louise spends 11 more summers with Charlie and Helen at her side. You need to know just how fond my father and his brother were of your grandparents. They were virtually members of the family. I identified your grandparents with Notamiset, that imposing property. For me, they were one and the same. Notamiset belonged to Charlie and Helen, wrote James Allen recently. After Mrs. Allen passes away, the main house at Notamiset is sold to the Simpson family. These Simpsons are very private people, but other members of the extended Simpson family live very public lives. One cousin invites reporters and photographers from Life magazine to his Upper East Side townhouse. Life publishes a photo essay about newly elected U.S. Congressman Kenneth Simpson from the New York Silk Stocking District and his attractive family. Within a month, the New York Times sadly reports his untimely death as page 1 news. Mrs. Simpson raises their 4 children. They include a scholarly son who marries an oil family heiress, according to a Times feature story. Mrs. Simpson receives moral support from her husband's friend, Alexander Kerensky. The Times reports in Kerensky's obituary that this former prime minister of the Russian Provisional Government of 1917 lives in exile in Mrs. Simpson's 5th floor house guest, as Mrs. Simpson's house guest for the last 25 years of his life. In contrast to the Upper East Side members of their extended family, the Simpsons of Notamiset do not appear in the New York Times, Life magazine, or in the New York Social Register updates. These Simpsons treat staff members Charlie and Helen very professionally, but not as family. One summer, when I visit Notamiset after the Simpsons arrive, I mention to my grandma Belson that I want to be an architect. She rolls her eyes. She believes that architecture is a profession for a rich man's son, and not my best choice. She indulges me and takes me on an inspection tour after the house cleaners leave. I help her fine-tune the major rooms. I learn how to wind up the Chippendale grandfather clock. I lift the Queen Anne dining room chairs from under the legs instead of pulling up on the arms. This helps preserve the fragile wood joints in the arms. She shows me how to use cotton swabs to remove the tarnish and pink silver polish still caught in the gadruni of a Rococo Revival silver christening cup. I help her make sure that the center line of the dining room table aligns with the center line of the Georgian windows at each end of the room. As I leave the dining room through the north door, Mrs. Simpson enters from the south. She speaks with my grandmother. I see Mrs. Simpson nod approvingly to my grandmother. Nothing appears to be out of line, except maybe me. On the last trip to Notamiset, I worked with my grandfather to help clear some overgrown cattails along the creekfront land previously owned by my Irish great-grandfather and his sister. I used my Polish grandfather's utility knife with a red handle to make the first cut, allowing me to successfully snap a bunch of cattails in half, using my 2 hands. This works until one of the cattails cuts deeply into my right index finger. It's my drawing hand. At the main house, my grandfather cleans the wound. He wraps the bandage tightly. He says with a wry smile, "I think Notamiset has scarred you for life." Years later, I invite my girlfriend to attend a campus reception with me for new members of a college literary society called Manuscript. Professor Simpson, a past president of the society, comes over to introduce himself to us. He is a renowned Egyptologist. His wife is a Rockefeller and a Standard Oil heiress. I cannot resist asking if the name Notamiset means anything to him. Professor Simpson is startled. Then he asks me, "What does Notamiset mean to you?" I look at my scar. All the old stories of Notamiset are new again. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That was nice. I never would have guessed that that was what the book was about, based on the title. Did you tell everyone the title?
The title is Wise Men Live in Houses Built by Fools, an architect's memoir by Charles Belson. So that one room where I'm standing and where my grandmother says, "This is not the right profession for you," that kind of all is a context for what later happens in the book.
Okay, well, wow. My name is Judy Pancoast, and I came to writing in a very roundabout way. I wrote short stories when I was an adolescent, which was a thing that I enjoyed very much, but quickly got taken over by my older brother. And he started to write short stories, and then he became the writer in the family. And apparently there can only be one writer in the family. So I went with music, which was really my passion. And I have been a musician, a working musician, my entire life. In 1998, I put out a Christmas album with a song on it called The House on Christmas Street. And that's also the name of my book.
So sing a few bars.
Of The House on Christmas Street? You want me to? No.
Okay.
People pay to hear me sing, buddy. No. It goes, it's got 47,000 twinkling lights and Santa Claus up on the roof, Dasher and Dancer and all the other reindeer, Rudolph's up there too, with a band of merry snowmen dancing on the porch, and a couple of carolers singing by the lamppost over near the front door. Jesus and his family in a stable on the lawn, and a choir of heavenly angels singing Silent Night till dawn. It's where everybody meets. It's the house on Christmas Street.
You know what the book's about.
Yes, that's what the book's about. It's actually, that song changed my life. I decided that if I ever had a song become famous, I wanted it to be that one because it would come back every year and I would never be forgotten. Because that's what happens with Christmas songs. The only time you hear Bing Crosby on the radio now is at Christmas, right? But you can't get radio stations to play music by an independent artist. So I tried and nothing happened. 8 years after I recorded the song, my husband was trolling on the internet and he found a video of a house in the Midwest where you could drive up and turn your radio to a low-frequency radio station, and the lights on the house went with the music that you were hearing on that station, and it was playing The House on Christmas Street.
Wow.
It was a miracle. And then since then, now, if you go on YouTube and you type in The House on Christmas Street, tons of video. It's all over the world. It's in places that I can't even speak their language. And I don't make any money because it's considered a private showing, even though it's at somebody's house and an audience is listening to it. But I get a lot of fan mail, and I have met a lot of Christmas decorators. And oh yeah, I have. I've gone on tours where I've gone all over the country at Christmas time and done concerts on people's lawns with their displays singing my song. But still, it's not famous. It's not, I don't think it will be coming back years from now. So I always brainstorm, what can I do to promote this song? And one day I was driving back from Tennessee and I thought of a story. And I thought, wow, this would make a great Hallmark original movie. But that was before I realized that all Hallmark does now is romances. And so the story is about an elderly woman who lives in a quiet neighborhood in Maine, and she feels like she has outlived her usefulness. No one needs her anymore, so she's sad. And she spends her days looking out the window and dreaming of what the neighborhood used to be like when she was a young mother, and the mothers all socialized with each other and they strolled their babies together and there were block parties and things like that. Now the neighborhood is just fractured. She doesn't even know her neighbors except for what she sees when she looks out the window. And then one day, a family moves up and buys the house across the street from her, and they're from Florida, where Mr. Bushnell was the prize-winning Christmas decorator in his town. And he proceeds to set up his Christmas display in September. And Muriel, our main character, now has a focus for all of her pent-up misery. She's gonna shut this display down. Just imagine what it's gonna do to their sleep, the lights, and the neighborhood, and the trash, and the traffic, and I've seen these things on TV, and they just cause awful things. So the story is about their battle. But the heart of the story is how the neighborhood actually comes together because of their battle. And all these people who are dealing with their own private lives. There's a single mom with an autistic son. There's a teenage boy whose mother died a year before and his father is descending into alcoholism. But it's all about how they all come together and end up getting involved in putting the display together. And in the end, of course it has a happy ending, but I'm not going to tell you how because I want you to read the book. So I was looking for an agent and a publisher for my book. I hired a writing coach because I never took a creative writing class. And I hadn't written a story since I was a kid. But I did hire a writing coach and then later had 2 different editors. And it still has typos in it, which drives me crazy. I was looking for an agent, and a friend of mine who is a published author said to me one day, why don't you just self-publish? Your audience that you already have as a musician will buy it. So I did. I went with a hybrid publisher, and I had 400 copies made, and I have 15 left, which I'm hoping to sell this weekend. But it also ignited my passion for writing again. And this is not my genre. This is, I'm told, is women's fiction. But the genre that I love to write in is horror. So since then, I've been writing horror stories, and I've had several published already, and I'm working on a novella. And then I recently started work again on the most horrifying story, which is my memoir. So I don't know where I fit in. I've done this Christmas happy book, and then I've done all these dark stories, and now I'm writing my memoir, and I don't know how to write a memoir, so I'm coming to all of the panels here that talk about writing memoirs, and that's my story. Oh, and I also write musical theater. Do you know who Joe Lansdale is? Well, you want to hear a story? I have time, because you read and I'm not reading. This is a story. Okay, so Joe Lansdale is one of my favorite authors. He writes dark fiction. He writes everything. There's no genre that you can put him into. But I'm a huge, huge, huge fan. And I found out maybe 10 years ago that a movie was being made from one of his stories called Christmas with the Dead. And I said, oh my God, it's a Christmas movie about zombies. I have to have a song on the soundtrack of this movie. I have to find a way. So I went to the website for the movie. This is a story. And on the website for the movie, you could write to Santa. So I wrote to Santa, Dear Santa, I'm a musician and I write Christmas music, and please make my Christmas wish come true. I want a song on the soundtrack of Christmas with the Dead. And I'm not going to tell you about everything that happened in between, but I ended up with 3 songs on the soundtrack of Christmas with the Dead. And Joe Lansdale and I ended up collaborating on a stage musical of Christmas with the Dead, and he is now a very close friend. So I went from being fangirl to collaborator, and it's just amazing. And he's the one who actually, I was working on this when I met him, but you know, first he asked me just to write the music, then he asked me to adapt the whole thing. And I said, I'm not a writer, I don't know. He said, do it and we'll see how it goes. And then he told me, when Joe Lancel tells you you're a writer, then you start writing. So that's when I started writing what I really want to write, which is horror fiction. So there you go, that's my story.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. And I would like to thank Cindy for everything she does, putting all of these events together for the library. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're right.
It is so important, and it gives everybody a chance to present themselves and to learn more and progress. So Cindy, we do thank you.
Yes, thank
So-
you.
Well, I am an author. My name is Vance Alexander, and I wrote my first book, which is called Expectant Journey. I started writing before I went back to school. I went back to school when I was 60 years old, and I took writing courses there, and I graduated with a BA in literature with concentration in writing. But before that, I had taken a course, not a course, but just a workshop with a young woman who was a teacher, and I wrote a story about my Christmas experience. And she encouraged me to send it to a local newspaper, which I did, and they did publish it. And then it was published again in another magazine, which was kind of nice. And then I started writing a lot of short stories, and they all got published. I have about 30 short stories out there that were published. I'm happy to say, and I'm not bragging. It just happened that people liked what I wrote. So I decided to write something long. But while I was in college, I took a course called nature writing, which was very interesting. One day our professor said we had to meet in Lakeville, Connecticut, and hike the Appalachian Trail from Lakeville to Massachusetts.
Wow.
Which we did. It was about 6 miles, and it was a great experience. I made it too. So when we got back to class the next day, he said, I want you all to write your views, what you saw, what it was like to hike the trail. So I had started writing what he wanted, and I got bored. Who cares what I did on my trail march? So I started writing a fiction piece. And I was into 15 pages before I handed it in to the professor, and he said, well, this isn't what I asked for. And I said, so what? I was 60 years old at the time, and he was probably 40, so he was going to let me do what I want, and he did. So it started out that way, and I produced this book from that point on. I'm just going to read you the back blurb, which is always something that interests people or gets people interested in the book itself. The year was 1801. Jared Brown is a handsome young man, born of a mulatto slave and a wealthy Connecticut plantation owner. Unusual for the time, his father treats him with the same love and respect as his son, Elijah, born to his white wife, Aphra. She is a cruel, greedy narcissist, intent on Jared's demise. An overheard and misunderstood conversation puts Jared on the run to Canada in search of freedom. On the way, he is able to sustain himself in the harshest environment of New England woods. His vast knowledge of flora and fauna keep him well fed on his trek. Many incomparable and harrowing experiences along the way change his outlook toward his fellow man. Although saddened by his situation, he is never bitter or resentful. If he's able to reach his goal, Canada, can he live as a truly free man? So that's the basis of the story. It contains many, many incidences of what he ate along the way, how he sustained himself, where he slept, his shelter, the people he met along the way. Interesting characters, one of which was Mumbet Friedman. Mumbet was the first black woman to actually win a judicial case against her master. I was thinking of masher because she was hit on the head by her master. And she just would not take the abuse any longer, so she did sue, and she won, which is kind of an interesting story. And Jared meets her along the way. He also meets a wonderful character who lives in a cave, and the cave is in Massachusetts, and it still is there, and I visited it, climbing up a trek with I needed a staff to get up to the top because it was slippery and quite a strange place. But the cave does exist. Now it's actually blocked off because of insurances and that sort of thing. But it was quite an experience. And so I followed his, I wrote about his journey along the way. Things like he would eat the young growth of cattails, which are very edible. He would also eat the top portion when they were green, like corn. If he had stayed longer, or if the times had changed, he would have taken the pollen from the cattail plant and used it as flour. So it has a lot of botanical instances in it, telling what he ate and how he managed to kill a deer and dress it and smoke parts of it so that it was edible for a long period of time as he continued on his journey. So that's basically the story. I could read you the first couple of pages, which kind of tells, a little bit about his start. The master of Salem plantation, Colonel Samuel Brown. By the way, we did have plantations here in Connecticut, just like we did in the South, and slavery was a big part in the early 19th century for blacks. Before that period, American Indians were used as slaves, but because they were not used to white man's ways, the white man thought they were lazy. They didn't want to do the work of the white man. They wanted to be free. They wanted to gather their own food. They didn't want to be chained or have anything negative that the white man was trying to give them. So, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, blacks were introduced to Connecticut. As a matter of fact, in the town of New London, at the time, there were 144 black slaves. New Haven had a great many slaves as well. And other areas around the country, around the state, had slaves, which most people don't think of. And Connecticut was a very agricultural center. We know that because if you look around you on your rides through the country, you see stone walls. Stone walls were built because they had to be taken out of the ground so that wheat could be planted, or barley, or whatever grains were necessary to sustain life. So we're an agrarian society, and slaves were absolutely necessary. So anyway, chapter 1. The master of Salem plantation, Colonel Samuel Brown, his wife Afra, and their 18-year-old son Elijah had just departed for a fortnight in New Haven. Left behind were Marisol, the beautiful mulatto slave, and Jared, her 18-year-old son, fathered by the colonel. They sat at a large scarred table in the kitchen before the hearth. Marisol drummed her fingers nervously. She was troubled and then finally spoke. "Listen carefully, Jared," she said, taking his hand. "You must leave the plantation tomorrow night. They cannot find you here when they return." Her golden eyes, filled with tears, were fixed on his. "Why? Where must I go, Mama? I don't understand." The boy was confused and upset. "'Cause Mistress Afra is finally going to get her wish. She will convince your daddy to sell you quick. Jared, honey, you have always been a symbol of her husband's lust. You are just a slave to her, a Negro." "Mama, why would she do that? Me and Elijah are brothers." "Only half. But we were raised the same lessons, same foods, and we dress alike." "That was your father's idea. At the end of the day, where do you go? Not upstairs with the rest of the family, but you come here to me. But you're my mother. And Mistress Afra is Elijah's. I know it's not fair, but we are slaves, you and me. You're lucky you can pass in the white world. Now, you gotta get away from New Salem Parish." "I thought you said I would be free in a year or so, Mama." "You would, Jared. You would be, Jared. In 1797, law says as a child of a slave, you would be free when you reach 21. But the mistress is mean and wants revenge on me and your father. Selling you will make her happy and hurt your daddy, and it would kill me. Why is this happening now? Because Mistress Afra's brother wants to be governor of Connecticut, and there can be no scandal, no half-Negro bastards in the family." They sat together for a while in silence. And the shock of what Marisol had said was sinking in. Jared knew his mother was right. He had often felt Mistress Afra's hatred while he and Elijah played or studied. She seldom addressed him by his name, but called him boy when her husband was not present. Jared often felt the sting of her slap and heard vile remarks when there were few witnesses. Although he resented her for what she did, he would never tell his father. Marisol had told him a long time ago that the mistress would look for any excuse to get rid of him if he exposed her. It would be tantamount to a lie. She would deny everything. So, that's the first part of the story. And then he leaves, and he goes from town to town in Connecticut, and it describes how this is in the area of Essex, Connecticut, that it takes place. And he goes up the Connecticut River, he crosses, he goes to each of the towns. The people he meets along the way are interesting characters. One of them is a young Scottish man who befriends him, and they walk together for a while, and they make camp one night, and the young man comes back, and he is itching like mad, but he's itching down below. And Jared asks him why did he think that? And he said, "I don't know, I just went in the woods and I did my business and took some leaves and
Oh, no.
turned out to be poison ivy."
Oh.
But since Jared was taught so much of the wildness by an Indian character in the book, he knew what to use as an antidote. So he went out and he picked sweet fern, boiled it down, used it, the Scotsman used it as a salve, and he was very happy with the results. So that's basically the story. How I got to be a writer. School, as I told you. And this was my first book. My second book takes place in Sicily. I had gone to Sicily many, many times and studied the work of a fantastic sculptor named Giacomo Serpota. All of his work is done in plaster. And it's just the most exceptional works of art you could imagine. But it's only on the island of Sicily, and that's the only place you could see it. Very little was written about him, so I created a fantasy called Oratory, which I have downstairs. I self-published. I wasn't going to go through the process. Well, I did try. I didn't get positive results. So when I decided to self-publish, I found out everything I could about the business. I formatted my own books. Formatting is organizing page by page and paginating each page properly and getting the work on alternate pages and chapter selections and just the total organization of the book. I happen to fortunately have some art talent, and I worked on the cover, and as you can see, what I did was I went into the woods and I photographed the scene, and for the young man who's traveling, his kind of ghost-like appearance with his gun in his pouch and his outfit of the time. I asked a friend to help me with the editing, which she did, and I was very grateful for that. And then I sent the manuscript away to a company in Georgia who does printing. And they were great. They reviewed everything, they looked at everything, made a few suggestions, which were fine, and I agreed with them. And then they printed the book. And lo and behold, here comes 4 or 5 boxes that weigh a ton, and no place to store them, but I did, with my 2 books in them. So it's been a happy experience to be able to write, and I have in the works, and I hate to say it, it's been years. It's been, well, I published this in 2012, and I wrote a sequel. The sequel is finished. All it needs is a little bit of editing and away it should go to be printed. But I've had other things to do in my life, so it's on the back burner. But anyway, not to bore you any longer, I do thank you for your attention, and I do thank Cindy again and the Norwalk Library for everything they do for us, and to the panel, who has just been wonderful. So, I guess that concludes it. How are we doing on time, Cindy?
Good. We have time for questions.
Okay, we have time for
Comments?
questions and answers. If anybody wants to know anything about any of us, we'll be glad to help, or speak, or whatever. Oh, this is so exciting. Look at a hand. Go ahead.
So I have 2 questions. I actually don't recall your name, but I remember your book titles.
I'm your father.
So, no, but this is the House on Christmas.
Judy, yes.
Yeah, Judy. So you had this passion that always was like nagging behind your mind about pursuing writing. What happened? Did your brother help you out? Did he inspire you? Did he quell the love? Like, couldn't do anything until a certain amount of time? Or like, how did you basically put that, how were you able to just not pursue it for so long?
I was able to not pursue it for so long because I was so involved in music.
Okay.
And, occasionally, I have to say, I did write little stories here and there, just when something would pop into my head, but I never did anything with them. And no, my brother had nothing to do with any of this. In fact, my brother and I became estranged later in life, which is a sad story. But when we got back together, when my sister passed away, he said, "What's this about you writing a book? I'm the writer in the family." And I said, "Well, I guess you aren't, since I've sold more copies than you ever have." And it was a great joy of my life that I was able to say that to him. I lived in a family where there was only one boy, and he was the apple of my mother's eye. So everything that was done was, everything he did was held up for, I mean, when I got nominated for a Grammy Award, I told my mother, and she said, well, Rodney did such and such a thing. So, you know, no, I didn't get any help from my brother. I just did it. The impetus of doing this one was, again, I wanted to promote my song. You know, but I had so much fun doing it, and then I got the encouragement of Joe Lansdale that I've continued to write continuously since then. So, did you have another question?
Not for
Okay.
you, but actually for the romance novels.
Do you need the microphones?
So it sounds like a lot of you guys, it wasn't your initial goal to be a writer, except for you. It sounded like you had a very clear vision that this was you went to school for, this is what you wanted to be. Is that accurate? Do you think that writers sort of fall into writing, or is it this dull desire that turns into a burning passion, or is it something like you're 12 and you're like, I'm gonna be a writer?
That's a really great question. I do think there are maybe two kinds of two general paths for writers. Those who, from a young age kind of want to be writers, think of themselves as writers, and I think I would kind of fall into that camp, although it wasn't really until I graduated college that I admitted to myself that I really wanted to be a writer. I avoided English classes in college because I kind of knew in the back of my head that that's something I really wanted, and so I avoided it, if that makes any sense. But then there's others who go through life and they have other things that are, that they're focused on, and then they get an idea for a story, or they decide that they really want to write a book about something in particular, and then they pursue that at that point in their life. Right now, it's November, it's National Novel Writing Month, and for anybody who's ever thought, whether it was a childhood dream or an adult dream, to write a book, it's a great time to just kind of get yourself in front of a computer or a piece of paper and start writing, because the challenge is to write a 50,000-word novel in 30 days, or a book, doesn't have to be a novel, memoir.
That's what I'm working on. That's
yeah.
why I pulled out my memoir to do for NaNoWriMo.
Awesome, yeah. So I'm writing the sequel to this book for NaNoWriMo right now.
We will be having the auditorium here available on 2 Sundays this month for people.
For write-ins.
And
Oh,
write.
awesome.
That's fantastic. So check the library website for NaNoWriMo events. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
I would have a slightly different kind of answer, which is, I think of writing as a disease you're born with. It's something you have to do. It's not something you choose to do. If you're a writer, you've got to do it.
Yeah. That gentleman over there has his hand.
Yeah, I myself write books, but I do in Spanish, right? And my question is, are you doing something else? It's now the country, they have a big population in the Spanish side. I think what you mentioned is wonderful stories. Are you doing, I have 2 questions, right? Are you doing something to get to the audience, Spanish people? And also, how, I wrote my books, but how you promoting? I mean, what's the best to, I don't want to be rich, but at least I want to reach to this, maybe this is one way, if you can give me some ideas.
I can address the promotion part. You have to contact libraries and set yourself up a library tour. And that's where I sold a lot of books. You just contact the library and say, I'm an author and I've written thus and such a book, and I was wondering if you host local authors at your library, or if you host independent authors at your library. And most of the time I never got a no. And that's how I started promoting this book, was I just set myself up a library tour. And luckily for me, I knew a lot of librarians because I do children's music at libraries. So that's the promotion aspect.
Whoa.
I agree. This library, Norwood Public Library, has been great about helping new authors. They have a session called Author Speaks still, yes. And it's usually at 12 o'clock. And the author is allowed to read their book, talk about their book, and promote their book and sell their book, which is wonderful because it's a good way of people getting to know you and what you do and your book. And of course, Cindy promotes really well the authors who do speak. And I've had the opportunity with both of my books to speak here at the library, and it's been great. And from that point, I also have spoken with book club groups, which is another good way to promote yourself and your books. So there's a lot of different ways you could promote yourself. Now, did you say you're writing a book that is Hispanic?
It's in
No,
Spanish.
no,
It's in Spanish.
I already wrote it. It's in Amazon.com, but it's in Spanish. It's not in English. My next plan is to, get somebody who can translate to English, maybe. And
In your
not
case,
it. I don't want to be rich or anything. I write because I like it, right? But in terms of the Spanish population, I did my presentation over here too, Mrs. Singh. It was nice to promote at one time. I don't know if you remember. But the Spanish people, they didn't come that often. I mean, I was new. Now I know a little bit more. I was new. I did a presentation, and then the pandemic came, and we were off, right?
Right.
But as an author, for instance, you were mentioning slavery. Many of the Spanish people that they came over here, they don't have great ideas or knowledgeable about the slavery era, how, what happened. It seems interesting in your book, right? And my second question is, what are you doing in order to get your books to the Spanish population? Because we have a big it's like the elections today.
Do they have groups that they organize in, like community groups of Spanish people that, clubs or anything like that? If I were you, that's what I would go to. I would go to, the local organization of, maybe there's a mother's club just for Spanish-speaking mothers or Spanish.
or how about your church?
Church
There
is
are a
another
lot
one,
of
yeah,
Spanish
church.
churches.
They have a small groups. but
Senior
it's-
Center South.
Yeah, it's not that well organized, though.
I would Google
But
Spanish
what-
group or Hispanic group or anything
Yeah,
like
I
that.
know, but it's not that well organized. Maybe that's another tax that probably the library, I don't know. But my question also is, what are you doing? It's like the elections, we're election time, right? And what are you doing to promote, to get your books to the Spanish population? It's a big population.
Not doing it at all.
Well, if I wrote Spanish books, I would do the same thing that I have done here. I would contact
No, what I'm saying.
Translation.
Translations,
Oh,
yeah.
translations.
Oh, I'm
Okay. I'm sorry, my Spanish is not that good. Just como esta.
I think many of us here are self-published, and having one's books in other languages is a great way to expand the audience and the worldwide potential readers of your books, but it costs money. And when you are self-published, you are trying to ideally maybe break even on what you spent
Yes,
to publish the
break
book.
even,
So for a lot of self-published authors, translations kind of go down the list. But once you reach a critical mass with a readership, if you're initially publishing in English language, then translations I think are definitely worthwhile investments, just like audiobooks or other formats for books. So it's definitely something that a person who is looking to expand their audience should consider. But it might not be the first thing on the list when we're trying to establish ourselves as authors.
Are there other questions?
I have a question. Charles, do you want to, you have it in your
Yes,
hand.
Yeah, in terms of promotion, there's a book out that you might be interested in. It's called the Connecticut Literary Anthology. Tomorrow there will be a speaker who is the editor of the 2022 version, from Woodhall Publications, Woodhall Press is going to be the publisher of the third edition of this. This is the first edition. The reason I brought it is that in January, this became sort of public domain. You could still buy it, but it's interesting that they put the whole book online. So all 40 authors and all 40 stories that they've written, they cover all genres, is available to you if you just go online and Google Connecticut Literary Anthology 2020. It comes up as their website, and you have your choice of any or all of the stories for no cost. So it's just something that you might be interested in. And you know, for an author like me, when I was starting out, I thought I had all of these stories that I had in mind. I picked one, and I submitted to this publication about 2 years ago, and it was selected. I think it was one out of, I think they published 40 out of 400, but still, if you would like to get that kind of exposure, I believe it's open until the 15th of November for submissions, if you're interested for this year.
We can put a link, we'll put a link on our website, and we can also put a link to that issue so that people can.
Yeah.
Okay, question to the audience. Does anybody out there want to become a writer? Let's hear a show of hands. Okay, 2, yay, 3, okay. Well, we know we've got good ones here already, but
I'm going to be a famous author, that's a different thing.
no, it's wonderful. I wish you the best of luck. It's a very lonesome kind of
Career.
Profession? Hobby? It depends.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do.
Yeah.
But remember, you're going to be sitting in front of a computer or with a pad in front of you, and you're going to be writing all by yourself. And I would suggest that you go out into the world and everything you hear and see, make notes. If you're sitting at a restaurant and the couple next to you is talking about something that's kind of interesting, jot it down.
Just record it on your phone.
I'm sorry?
Record it on your phone.
Right.
Nowadays, you can do that.
You know, and as far as, well, about your schooling, I started writing, and as I said, I wrote a lot of short stories that were sold before I went to school. And I just wanted a BA, that's why I went back to school. So if you have an innate talent, just write. And the thing is, write. You don't have to do it every day. And there are authors who do write every single day. I'm not one of them. I write in spurts. I could sit down and write 4 pages and then not look at it again for the next week or 2, and then go back to it. But I know people who just sit in front of their computer or with a pad in front of them and write. So you're going to have to develop your own style of writing. And you know, it's important for you to feel what you're writing. And you don't necessarily have to live the things you're writing about. It's good to have a background of knowledge of what you're writing about, but it doesn't have to come from life experiences. So just take that pencil and paper or that computer and sit there and write, and write, and write. That's the thing. So,
Thank you.
Other questions we can get to? I don't want to have anybody walk out without getting their question.
They know where to find us, don't worry.
And yes, tomorrow, all day tomorrow as well as
We
today.
have one more.
I think Vance kind of answered my question, because I was going to ask about your writing practice. Like, there are people who turn out a mystery book every year and they write every day. And then there are others, it seems as though for some of you it's a part-time project. So it's when you have time or when you get an idea. But I just wondered about it.
Another way of looking at it, it's different for everybody.
Sure.
But I figured putting words in the page is the easy part. I'm writing every moment of every day. The characters come alive, you're thinking of what happens next. It happens in your head. You work it all out there. You work it out in your dreams, okay? But putting the words to the page is simple. If you're to that point, then you're very far along.
Exactly, he's got a great point. In your head, there are so many things that go on, and you actually, well, I've met some of the people in my novels, but it's in my head where I met them. And I can have conversations with them, and I know what they should be thinking, and then that goes on the paper when I sit down and write. So use your brain power, you have it, just write. Write. That's the name of the game. And I'll shut up now.
Good.